Vaccines, a highly politically charged conversation for anyone to have, which will immediately get you banned not only from some places on the internet, but also from dinner with friends if you happen to even question it. And we're not really going to do that in this video. No, we're not going to talk about the science. Instead, I want to talk about the business of vaccines, because someone a couple of weeks ago asked me an interesting question. Why is it that life-saving cancer medications can cost thousands of dollars, but vaccines are free? There is a clear answer to that, but it did delve me into just an interesting question of how do vaccines make money? To finding out that some of the vaccines that we still are mandated today make a whopping 77% profit margin, which is crazy. And of course, millions per year are spent on lobbying to ensure that certain companies' vaccines are pressed onto the public. And they do great work. A lot of them, if not most of them, if not all of them, have saved millions and millions of lives. But like anything that is for profit, we should be slightly skeptical. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to jump into, first of all, the history of vaccines, and then the entire business of vaccines, how they make money, how they're funded, and why they're mandated in this episode of the Jason Hassett Show, which is likely going to get me cancelled because, as I said, for some reason, this topic has become incredibly politically charged, which is incredibly annoying. Welcome to the show. Let's get into it.
Do it live!
I am not going to exploit.
A Pizza Express in Woking.
Your line of questioning is transphobic.
Now watch this drive.
Fucking thing sucks!
This video is brought to you by checkmythumbnail.com, the analysis tool for YouTubers by YouTubers. Try it free today. Hello everybody and welcome to the Jason Hassett Show, and this week we're going to be talking about one of the more controversial topics lately, which is kind of annoying to be honest, because topics like this shouldn't be controversial. You should be allowed to just have discussions around it. And of course, this week I'm talking about vaccines. You've already clicked on the video, so you know that. And one of the key areas I want to go into in this is the actual business of vaccines, because we should always look at anything with a healthy dose of skepticism when there's money involved, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to kick off with the entire history of vaccines, a kind of brief run through basically where vaccines came from, where they started, and how they've built up to the big industrial machine that they are today, and then jump into the business of vaccines. As always, if you're new here, the research for this has been collected for me from the interwebs, which, as you probably are aware by this stage, is violently unreliable. And therefore, if there's anything that you think is wrong, anything I've missed, or anything you think that should be added as crucial context to this, please, please, please do add it to the comments below, especially around topics like this. Your feedback is invaluable. And while you're down there, why not hit that like button, hit subscribe, and hit that little notification bell so you can be notified whenever these come out, so that I, like these big drug companies, can get some of that cold, hard cash. Let's jump into it. So the concept of immunization actually predates vaccines as we know them, and it goes back to as early as the 10th century in China, where practitioners used variolation, deliberately exposing people to smallpox material from scabs or pustules to induce mild infection and confer immunities. So even back then, the Chinese understood that there was a natural immunity you would build up to certain, strains of diseases by having them once. And if you could give people a safer dose of that, then essentially you could build up their immunity. So this was done a long, long time ago. This practice then spread to Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and India by the 15th to 17th centuries. And then in 1721, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu introduced variolation to Europe after observing it in Turkey, where it crucially reduced the mortality rate in smallpox. By the mid-1700s, variolation was common but risky. It had a 1 to 2% fatality rate, which is very, very high by modern standards, obviously. And in 1774, farmer Benjamin Jesty in England informally tested cowpox exposure for smallpox protection, foreshadowing formal vaccination. In 1796, though, we got the first true vaccine, pioneered by Edward Jenner, not to be confused with Bruce Jenner or Caitlyn Jenner, as she is now known. I don't think they're related. Could be. Who knows? Guess neither of them were very good at driving cars, given it was 1796 and... Anyway, Observing that milkmaids exposed to cowpox rarely contracted smallpox, he inoculated 8-year-old James Phillips with cowpox material from a milkmaid's sore, and Phillips developed mild symptoms but was immune when later exposed to smallpox. Jenner published his findings in 1798, coining the word vaccination from the Latin word for cow, which was vacca. Actually, the Spanish for cow is vaca, so that's where it actually comes from. And in 1799, vaccinations spread to the US, with Philadelphia establishing a lazaretto for quarantine and immunization. In 1801, Russian Empress Maria Fedorovna promoted it, and by 1805, Italy attempted the first compulsory vaccination. The US established its vaccine agency all the way back in 1813 to distribute smallpox vaccines. Jenner's work reduced smallpox cases dramatically, though even back then, there was some pushback on this due to fears of side effects. The 1800s saw vaccines transition to laboratory science. In 1817, cholera pandemics began, killing millions and spurning research. Louis Pasteur advanced the field, and in 1879, he created the first lab-produced vaccine for fowl cholera in chickens, and in 1881, Pasteur developed an anthrax vaccine for livestock. His breakthrough came in 1885 with rabies vaccines, administering a version of this to a young 9-year-old, Joseph Meester, post-rabies bite, saving his life at the time. In 1884, Jaime Ferrini-Clua created a cholera vaccine, though the efficacy of that particular one was widely debated. And it should be noted as well, by the way, that Louis Pasteur is also the person who came up with pasteurization for milk. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. By 1894, Anna Wessels Williams isolated a diphtheria strain for antitoxin, and in 1896, Almut Wright developed a typhoid vaccine used by the British military in 1899. In 1899, Half Klein created a plague vaccine amid outbreaks in India. The plague is a weird one, isn't it? Like, it's kind of a thing we think of in like sci-fi or biblical times or whatever, not like a real thing. Like, I know it is, but just, it's, anyway. I love the Sean Locke joke on this.
Do you know who discovered the mumps?
No.
Who?
Have a guess.
Dr. Mumps?
No. It was actually discovered by Dr. Gonorrhea. He was saving his name for something a bit more serious. I can't waste my name on a little red lump. Something that rots the cock.
Something that rots the cock. The 1900s accelerated vaccine development. In 1905, the US Supreme Court upheld compulsory vaccination in Jacobson v. Massachusetts. And in 1909, freeze-dried vaccines enabled tropical use. In 1914, a pertussis or whooping cough vaccine emerged. Of course, then there was the latest pandemic before the COVID one, the Spanish flu in 1918 to 1919, which caused them to massively push for some sort of influenza vaccine after 50 million deaths from the flu, though at the time it was ineffective. In 1922, the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis was developed by Albert Calmette and Camille Guerin, recommended by the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the UN, which just sounds way more something out of like a sci-fi film or whatever than a real institution. The League of Nations in 1928 recommended it despite controversies like the 1929 Lubeck disaster, where 72 infant deaths were caused by a contaminated batch. In 1926, a diphtheria vaccine was licensed, and in 1930, a Q fever vaccine appeared. In 1935, early polio trials failed. In 1936, Max Thieler developed a yellow fever vaccine approved in 1938, and Thieler won the Nobel Prize for it in 1951. In 1938, a tetanus vaccine was created for the first time. And in 1960, Albert Sabin's oral polio vaccine, or OPV, was approved, eradicating polio in Czechoslovakia first. And in 1963, the measles vaccine was licensed, the Rubovax. In 1968, the mumps vaccine. And in 1969, the rubella vaccine. These are all now combined in MMR. And in 1980, WHO declared smallpox eradicated. I think you should be careful about doing that. It's like, we have it under control is a better way to say it than it's gone now. You can go out and kiss cows. You know, I think we should be a little more careful about these victory callings that we have. Anyway. Yeah, look, there's a lot of these. And that leads us all the way up then to the COVID vaccine. Obviously, there's been others like the dengue vaccine and so on. But the big one in all of our memories is the COVID vaccine, which was put on just warp speed in terms of development and so on, using the mRNA technology. So between 2020 to 2021, there was over 1 billion doses doled out across the world, which is absolutely nuts. By a variety of companies from Pfizer to AstraZeneca to Johnson & Johnson and so on. And there's been lots of skepticism and controversy as well as some great things around it and so on. But that is not really the topic. I wanted to cover the quick history. If you want me to get into like the science of vaccines at some point, I'm happy to do that. Let me know in the comments. I wanted to talk about the business, to be honest, more than anything, because I'm not a scientist. I'm not like a chemical scientist. So it's not really my wheelhouse. I'm interested in it. I read about it and so on. But you know, for me, it's one of these things where when it comes to vaccines, I've got some friends who work in actual labs that makes vaccines and so on. And I usually like, if I need one or my daughter needs one and I'm a bit like, oh, why do we need to vaccinate for that? I'll usually call one of them that I trust. I'm not saying that's the best method. You should probably just talk to a doctor, but these are people I trust who I know are just, obsessed with this. So I call them usually. But anyway, the point is, if you want me to talk about the in-depth science and how I feel about it and so on, you can do that in a different episode. Ideally one where I'll get two maybe opposing people who, a vaccine scientist who's a bit more skeptical and one who's a bit more optimistic, and we'll have a roundtable conversation about it. Be interesting. But the main thing I wanted to talk about in this episode was the business of vaccines, because we do need to remember that, like anything in the world, these companies are not making these vaccines out of the goodness of their heart. Like, it can start off that way. Definitely, it can start off that way with a scientist or someone trying to cure something that has affected a loved one or affected people they've seen. Like, things start out that way. But at the end of the day, these are big companies like Pfizer and so on producing these that have a fiduciary responsibility to make money. They legally have to make money and produce revenue for their shareholders. So they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. This is a money-making organization. And we need to keep that in mind, because that is why you should be asking questions. Like, I think it's gone too far where it's a political thing now of one side is anti-vaccine, one side is pro-vaccine, and no one can be in the middle going, okay, I think this one's a good idea, this one's a good idea. Why do we need that one? What's this? I think you should be allowed to ask questions, talk to doctors, talk to experts and so on. But anyway, the point is that pharma does influence doctors and policy. For example, in the US, pharmaceutical companies spend billions a year marketing to physicians, including $2 to $3 billion annually on payments for consulting, speaking, and meals. These tactics are associated with a 1 to 2% increase in prescribing costs per payment increment. Lobbying further shapes policy, with the industry on track to spend around $450 million in 2025 lobbying Congress people, senators, and so on, often advocating for intellectual property protections and expanded mandates for certain drugs and vaccines. The vaccine industry today represents a complex interplay of innovation, public health impact, and economic incentives, with a projected market value of around $90 billion by the end of 2025, up from $86 billion in 2024. This market is dominated by a handful of multinational corporations, primarily GlaxoSmithKline, Merck & Co., Pfizer, and Sanofi, which collectively hold around 80 to 90% of the revenue share, thanks to their control over patented products and extensive manufacturing capabilities. These firms have seen substantial revenue. Merck leads this at around $64 billion in overall pharma revenue in 2024. That's overall revenue, not just vaccines, to be clear, and followed by Pfizer and so on. Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, for example, generated tens of billions of dollars in peak revenue in the last years. The business model relies on high-margin sales of innovative vaccines balanced against significant R&D risks and is supported by global distribution networks and policy frameworks. However, as a profit-driven sector is intertwined with government mandates, it obviously, as I've said, will invite scrutiny over potential conflicts between commercial interests and public welfare. At the end of the day, the point here is it is up to the government and medical experts to talk to you about the dangers, the side effects, to check that these are properly tested. Because at the end of the day, the pharma company isn't financially incentivized to tell you if they found a problem. We found this over the years with a variety of companies. So this is my point about it's very important to understand the business of vaccines. Revenue primarily stems from direct sales to governments, healthcare providers, and private markets, with patented vaccines commanding premium prices due to limited competition. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna collectively earned around $90 billion in 2021 to 2022, with profit margins reaching up to 77% on these products. That is insane. I did not realize the profit margin for a product that they were selling to the government would be up to 77%. Like, that's a lot. That's crazy. But development costs are steep. Typically $500 million to $1 billion per vaccine over 10 to 15 years, encompassing clinical trials, regulatory approvals, and failures, with success rates below 7% for candidates entering phase 2. Funding comes from a mix of internal profits, like the $90 billion we just talked about 18% reinvested into R&D. So roughly 18% of the profits that they make get reinvested into research and development. Government grants from the NIH, for example, and philanthropic sources like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Once off patent, vaccines face lower margins due to generic and biosimilars, but market concentration, with the top 4 firms controlling most sales, allow sustained pricing power. And that's something you keep in mind. For example, if you are buying like an antibiotic, your doctors, not everywhere, but in a lot of Western countries, are incentivized to give you the version of it that is by some manufacturer, as opposed to the generic version of a drug, which can cost, sometimes as low as like 10% of the cost of the one that they're telling you about, when they're essentially the exact same drug. Especially in Western countries where they're highly, highly regulated, it's the same drug essentially. So you should keep that in mind. Sometimes you can save a fortune just by looking at the generic similar drug. It's harder, for example, with kids. Like, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and sometimes the generic doesn't taste as good, for example, which I know sounds crazy, but that can be a big deal when you've got like a 3 or 4-year-old who doesn't want to take medication anyway. Something to keep in mind. Like, a vaccine is like any other drug. It goes through these similar processes. Obviously, emerging players in India and China, like the Serum Institute, are capturing volume through low-cost production for global programs, and this model incentivizes innovation for high-burden diseases in wealthier markets, but can undervalue vaccines for neglected tropical diseases in low-income areas where profitability is lower, especially without government subsidies. So look, as I said from the very start, vaccines are a business. So how are they manufactured and made available in our modern capitalist world? Well, vaccine production is highly capital intensive, requiring specialized facilities costing 50 to 300 million each, with processes including cell cultures, fermentation, purification, and sterile packaging. Bacterial vaccines are more scalable than viral ones, but all demand rigorous quality controls to prevent contamination, as seen in historical incidents like the 1955 Qatar polio vaccine recall. And key manufacturers include Serum Institute of India, producing 1.3 billion doses annually, covering 50% of global childhood vaccines, and China's national biotech group, alongside the Western giants we've already mentioned. Distribution leverages public and private channels. In the US, 57% of childhood vaccines are procured via federal programs like VFC, Vaccines for Children, ensuring access for uninsured families. Global organizations like UNICEF supply vaccines to 80 and 100 countries, while Gavi Alliance funds immunization for 65 million children in low-income settings annually. And then obviously in a lot of countries, vaccines are essentially mandated. You're not forced to vaccinate your child, for example, here where I am in Mexico, but it's very much put on a program where you're educated to take these, and the government kind of mandates that these vaccines need to be freely available to the public for a variety of reasons, and it differs like country to country, place to place. But over 160 countries mandate at least one vaccine, with 59% imposing penalties like fines or school exclusions to boost compliance. They don't do that here. And I also think, look, this is going into the other conversation. I think that's a bad way to do things. I don't think you should ever like impose penalties or school exclusions and so on. I get why you do it. I'll talk about it at the end, like, you know, why. I'll talk about it in a minute, why obviously governments are incentivized to make sure people are vaccinated. But I think like forcing people to do it through these exclusions is the wrong way to do it. I think you should just educate people. But anyway, in Europe, 13 nations require comprehensive pediatric schedules. For example, France and Hungary cover nearly all recommended vaccines. The US delegates mandates to states, guided by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which influences coverage rates exceeding 90% for many childhood vaccines. The WHO's expanded program on immunization aims for universal access, yet 1 in 5 children worldwide remain unvaccinated, often due to infrastructure in low-income places. And mandates enhance availability and herd immunity, but spark debates over personal autonomy, as I've just said, especially when tied to profit-driven industries. While they have proven effective in eradicating diseases like smallpox, resistance grows amid concerns that commercial interests might amplify perceived needs. This is the point I was trying to get to, which is, look, I think it's a good idea to mandate these and have them freely available for everybody. And you should educate people that, you know, we want to get these certain types of vaccines. At the end of the day, like, you can think about this as like the inverse of smoking in many ways, which is the government has a clear interest and an actual interest outside of just, say, helping pharmaceutical companies in lobbying and influence, which we'll get to in a moment. The government has a clear interest in making sure that certain vaccines are available, right? Because if people don't take vaccines and, for example, you give free healthcare to certain people, which most Western countries do, then you're creating you're stopping the long tail of burden, right? So by giving vaccines, which are, say, relatively cheap compared to giving, healthcare coverage later on, you're paying some money up front to save a lot of money down the line. So it does make sense, and also by having a healthier workforce, less deaths and so on, you're creating a stronger economy. So it's not all some weird, like, crazy idea of, oh, we need to vaccinate people because it gives money to our friends in, X company. Like, I'm sure some of that goes on, and that's why I think you should always be skeptical. But the point is, it does, from just a logical reasoning, make sense of, if we can vaccinate this disease, then it's not burdening our healthcare system later on. The inverse, like I said, of smoking, which is if you can push up the price of smoking, make it, that everyone knows the risks, just tax it to oblivion. If you can cut down on people smoking, then it will help later on because there'll be less people coming in for lung cancer and so on that we then have to pay for out of taxpayer money later on, So it does make sense in another way. I'm kind of against the idea of like forcing people, because I think as soon as you do that, people start, especially in a capitalistic world where that like forcing someone to do something, the immediate thing is, how are you making money off that? Like, if you're telling me I need to do something, my question immediately becomes, how are you making money off this? You know what I mean? So like, I think it's the wrong way to go about it. Like with smoking, if they say you can't smoke here, immediately I'm like, well, I'm going to start smoking more now. Whereas if you just tell me like, okay, smoking causes this and this and this, and it's going to make your teeth rotten and so on. Yeah, I'm going to go, oh, okay, right, fair enough. Yeah, you've presented the facts. That's a pretty good argument. I'll do that. So with my daughter, for example, when it comes to vaccines, the list is given to me with all of the different vaccines, all the information's there. And I'm like, yeah, she should get all of these. And there's one or two where I've been like, that seems odd. Like, why is she getting that one? And then I can call up friends and go, and by the way, I mean friends who I know who are experts in this stuff, and go, why would you get this? And they give me a proper argument as to why it's a good idea. And I'm like, oh, actually, yeah, that's fine. Cool. Go ahead. or like when the COVID vaccine came out for me, for example, immediately I was like, that's very quick. Let me do some looking into this. They were mandating that you should get it and so on. In this country, it was a little bit lighter, but back home, it was very blunt about it. And here, where they just told us it's free, this is why you should get it, I looked into it and went, yeah, I'll get that. Whereas I know some friends back home, when they were like, you have to get this or you can't leave your home, we're like, no, I'm not getting it now because clearly you have a reason for this. So I think people and countries, and I will get back to the lobbying bit in a minute. My rant on this is I do think as soon as you start forcing people to do something, they're going to be far more skeptical. Like the idea of mandating it to where you have to get it, I think that's just a wrong way to go about things always. And I know you can say like, oh, well, they're endangering me and so on. Sure, you could take that tact. But in reality, you're not going to do yourself any favors by telling people they have to do something. In the same way that if they told you, if you're, for example, someone in, let's say, California where this like sparked up, that would be like me telling you, you have to vote for Donald Trump, You're not going to do it, are you? Like, think about it from that point of view. As soon as someone tells you you have to do something, you're immediately questioning why. So I don't know. But anyway, let's get back to it. I think it's just the wrong way to go about it. I think you should educate people and allow open conversations about these things, and the facts will come through. And we have enough dissenting voices now that if you just let open conversation go, the smartest voices hopefully will win out. And if they don't, then that's a bigger problem we need to fix. If you have to mandate things because people are listening to the wrong people, then that just means you need to put more money and effort into getting the right advice out there, getting the right discussions in front of people, as opposed to trying to shut down and force people to do things. Anyway, so the pharmaceutical industry, including vaccine makers, this is the wider pharmaceutical industry, which includes vaccines, exerts significant influence through lobbying, spending a record $227 million in the first half of 2025 alone. Most of this is around the US, by the way. But anyway, on pace to surpass the 2024 figure of 338 million. And from 1999 to 2018, total US lobbying reached around 4.7 billion, outpacing all other sectors in terms of lobbying money, and with $92 million in Q1 of 2021 during COVID peaks. Key players like PHRMA spent $29 million in 2023, $29.7 million from the first to third quarter of this year so far, advocating for intellectual property protections, mandate expansions, and opposition to any sort of price controls. Again, this is specifically on vaccines. It's very, very hard to find out the exact figures on vaccines alone. So that will be interesting. If anyone out there works, in correlating that, I would love to hear from you and find out like what's the exact amount on vaccines. I think that would be really interesting. It should be public. Beyond lobbying, companies influence doctors through detailing, sales reps providing information, samples, and perks. And this is a big thing in the US, obviously more so than anywhere else, really. In the US, 90% of marketing budgets target prescribers, with payments totaling $3.6 billion in 2019, excluding research. Studies showed these interactions boost brand name prescriptions by 1.3 to 1.8% per payment increase, raising costs and potentially leading to overprescription, which doesn't sound like a lot percentage-wise, but this can lead to raising costs and overprescribing in many situations. The opioid epidemic, which we will cover at some point on this channel, is a huge, huge, huge example of that. For vaccines, this may cause a problem of emphasizing newer products that are still under patent and therefore are far more profitable, that 77% that we mentioned earlier. Though, it should be said, evidence doesn't really support that. And I think that's something we should be very open and obvious about, which is the evidence hasn't shown this, but there is the danger of it happening. And just to know on some of the figures as well, what I said earlier is that the evidence does show that vaccines save $16 in healthcare spending per $1 invested. So they do make money back in the long tail, as I said earlier on, according to the evidence. In countries like India, for example, where you have high population concentrations, Vaccinations can save a fortune on healthcare spending later on, up to $44 per $1 spent on research and development. So, this can be great. Like, it is very, very interesting. But despite positives, the model's high risk, so 10 to 15 year timelines, billion-dollar plus cost, and only a 7% at most success rate. This can deter investment in less profitable areas, leading to market failures for diseases like malaria or TB. Profit pressures may encourage over-promotion, as in like non-vaccine cases that we know about, like Purdue Pharma, for example, with the opioid epidemic. GSK's $3 billion fine, for example, in 2012 for off-label promotion of Paxil. Pfizer's $2.3 billion fine in 2009 for Bextra. Merck's $950 million fine for Vioxx in 2011. J&J's $2.2 billion fine for Risperdal in 2013. All of these illustrate how these aggressive tactics can prioritize sales over actual evidence, potentially applying to vaccines if lobbying, and money emphasizes mandates over actual evidence. This is why we do need to be skeptical and careful. Look, the simple fact, I can't put this any clearer. Skepticism is always warranted for any mandated, profit-driven exercise. If something is mandated, as in the government is telling you need to do this, and the company who is providing it is making a profit on it, you should always be skeptical about that. It doesn't mean it's inherently a bad thing. I'm not saying that. But you should, of course, read the fucking label. Do the research. Of course. Lobbying can shape policy, favoring industries, raising costs while influencing doctors and so on. So, look, at the end of the day, the point here is that this is a big business at the end of the day and something we should always be careful about. And my final wording on this is that, look, this was just a short video to go through the business of vaccines because I found it interesting just after that conversation I was talking about recently. And what annoys me now is it's like the climate change thing, which we'll discuss in a couple of weeks, which is, this whole thing of, no, the science is done. We're finished on this. If you don't like vaccines, you're anti-vax. And it's not even like if you don't like vaccines, it's like if you have a conversation where you're like, what was the research on that? What about these side effects? Like, do we know how they come out? The conversation turns to, oh, you're a vaccine skeptic or you're anti-vax. It's like, no, I just think we should question this, which doesn't happen. Like, it happens in a few things that have just become so politically charged, which really annoys me. And on both sides, by the way, because what happens is in America specifically, on the right side, you get this, all vaccines are bad almost, or, vaccines are terrible, which is not the case in my opinion. And then on the left side, you get you should take every vaccine. You should inject everything you can find out on the street, which has vaccine on the label. And if you don't, you're anti-vax and a vaccine skeptic. And to me, both sides are bad. We should always fall somewhere in the middle. We should always have a conversation about, hold on a minute, I'm injecting something into my veins. If this was heroin, I'd be asking you, why am I doing this? So why is it not the case for anything else? If someone's making money off of it, I want to know damn well why they're doing it. And I think people go too extreme, which is like, there are good things that make a great amount of money. We are talking right now about this conversation, right? YouTube is a great thing. It makes a fortune. I will inevitably make money, probably, unless this gets demonetized, which it probably will actually, off this video. That doesn't mean the conversation is inherently bad. Maybe the video is bad. Probably is. I'm making it. But there are lots of things in the world that make money and are good. There are lots of things in the world that make money and are bad. The question is, what is the upside? What is the benefit? And I think it is fair that the people who come up with these incredible life-saving things should make a bit of cash. That's fine. That's capitalism. That's the world we live in. But, we should understand that goes on. And understand that in any money-making endeavor, there's going to be bad actors who will put money over lives. Before you turn around and say to anyone, including in the comments here, you're anti-vaccine or a vaccine skeptic, I'd ask them, why are you not asking simple questions? Like, before injecting something into your body. You wouldn't sign a contract without reading the fine print. And if you do, you're an idiot. So why would you inject something without reading the fine print? It doesn't make any sense to me. But that said, These vaccines have saved millions and millions of lives. They've helped millions and millions of children. So they shouldn't be completely written off either. The other side is wrong too. And this is a major problem. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of have these conversations on this channel, because the world has gotten to a point now where we're just too fucking politically charged. You know, everyone's in a team sport now instead of talking about policy. I remember when I was going to university only a decade or so ago, I remember having conversations around policy, like actual policy, instead of conversations around, well, that guy's pushing it, so it's clearly evil, or this guy's pushing it, so he's clearly a moron. I think we need to start asking these questions again. The good news is, the way I'm doing this channel is we're going to have one serious conversation every 2 weeks, and the week in between, we're going to have a fun conversation, like the one about Hooters last week. And that's the point of this channel. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do subscribe. And, feel free to call me a moron in the comments. I appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
Do it live!
I am not going to exploit.
A Pizza Express in Woking.
Your line of questioning is transphobic.
Now watch this drive.
Fucking thing sucks!